I should have gone alone. It's not Lily's fault. Let me make that clear right from the start. She was 6 years old and got excited when I told her I was spending the weekend at Grandpa Earl's house, and I needed that. Needed someone pumped up on my side because I wasn't. I can't say I was truly grieving. It was more like a nameless weight, the kind that sits in your chest. Earl had died in February, alone, in the front bedroom, and for 3 months no one had been inside the house. I was the only Pruitt who lived less than 4 hours from Blue Ridge, so it fell on me. We took 515 North on a Friday afternoon. Lily slept most of the way with her cheek pressed against the window and a book about sea turtles under her head, because she'd forgotten her pillow and wouldn't take the folded jacket I offered her. The book was from school. I don't know why that detail stuck with me. The house sits about 2.5 miles outside Blue Ridge, at the end of a dead-end road the county never paved. The last mile is gravel and packed dirt, and in March the dirt was still soft. I could feel the tires sinking slightly on every curve. The truck had 180,000 miles on it, and I'd promised Deb I'd get the brakes checked before the trip, but I never did. So I drove slow. When the house came up in the headlights, Lily woke up like she knew, like she sensed it. She stared out the window with her eyes still heavy from sleep and said, "It looks smaller." I agreed because it was true. Without Earl inside, the house looked smaller. I went in first to unlock the door and turn on the lights. The living room switch was on the left side of the door, and I needed a second to remember that. The muscle memory from when I used to visit him in the summers as a kid, feet dirty with Georgia clay. The light came on. The smell came with it. Damp wood. That undertone of clothes stored too long. Sheets flannel. A wool coat that had soaked up years of cigarette smell and never let it go. The central heat had been off during the months the house sat closed, and it had absorbed the cold and the moisture like a sponge. It wasn't unpleasant in a way that makes you turn away. It was unpleasant in a way that makes you stop for a second, because you recognize that smell. It's the smell of a place someone lived in for a very long time and then stopped living in. Lily came in right behind me and headed straight to the kitchen without asking the way she always did. I heard the refrigerator open. Empty, I'd warned her, and close. Then she went down the hall and turned on the light in the bedroom that was hers when she visited Earl. I followed with the bags. The room had a sash window that faced the east side of the property, where the woods began. Earl had put a screen on that window about 10 years back, because Lily was around too and he was worried about mosquitoes. The screen was gray, a little loose in the bottom right corner, but it was there. I didn't pay attention to it that night. While I unpacked the bags, Lily wandered through the house in her way. That way kids have, that's like a little inventory. Touching things, opening drawers, picking up objects, and putting them back down for no apparent reason. She picked up a photo of Grandpa Earl that sat on top of the dresser, looked at it for about 5 seconds, and put it back. Didn't say a word. I made instant mac and cheese on the stove because that's what I'd brought, and because it was what Lily always asked for on the nights she stayed with me at the apartment. We ate at the kitchen table with the living room TV on some cooking channel neither of us was watching, just for the noise. Other than that, the house was quiet in a way an apartment never is. No cars going by, no neighbor upstairs, none of that constant background hum a city produces and that you only notice when it's gone. In a way, at first, that felt good. Lily fell asleep fast. I sat in the rocking chair on the back porch for about 20 minutes in the dark, not doing anything. I thought about my father. The woods started about 100 feet from the porch. First a strip of tall grass Earl never mowed right. Then the wire fence he'd put up to separate the property from the slope. Then the trees. Pines mostly, mixed in with oaks that still had no leaves that time of year. There was a moon, but not much of one. You could make out the outline of the trees. I didn't hear anything strange, I can say that honestly. I went back inside, locked the back door, checked the front door, turned off the living room lights. Before going to my room, I stopped at Lily's doorway just to look in. She was on her side, holding the turtle book. The window was shut but not latched. I hadn't looked for the lock and the sash window didn't have a key, just a wooden catch that fit into place when you pushed the frame down. I went to sleep. The next thing I heard was her voice. Not very loud, but with that specific tone kids have when they're caught between sleep and awake and don't quite know what they're feeling. She called out, "Dad," once, then again a little more awake. I got up. Lily was sitting up in bed when I walked into the room. Not crying, not screaming, just sitting there, the blanket pulled up to her chin and her eyes open, staring at the window. The hallway light came in through the gap in the door and threw a yellow strip across the floor between us. She didn't turn to look at me when I came in. She kept staring at the window. I asked her what happened. She said, "There's a big dog outside." She said it with that calm kids have when they haven't decided yet whether to be scared or not. Like she was passing along information, waiting for me to know what to do with it. I looked at the window. The frame was in the same position I'd left it. Pushed down, the wooden catch fitted in place. The screen behind the glass was dark. Outside was pitch black, and the way the hallway light hit the room, the glass worked more like a mirror than a window. I could see my own reflection, gym shorts and a t-shirt, hair smashed from the pillow. I couldn't see anything beyond that. I asked if she had heard it or seen it. "Heard it," she said, breathing. She paused for a second, really loud. I sat down on the edge of the bed next to her, put my hand on her shoulder over the blanket. I told her it was probably a deer, maybe a dog from one of the neighbors that had gotten out for a walk. Told her that kind of thing happened out in the country, that Grandpa Earl had mentioned it once. I was making it up. Earl had never said anything like that. Not that I could remember, but Lily didn't know that. She looked at me with that expression 6-year-olds have when they're deciding whether the adult is being straight with them. Then she said, "Go check." So I went. Not because I thought I'd find anything. I went because it was the kind of thing a dad does. You go, you check, you come back and confirm there's nothing there, and then the kid goes to sleep. I grabbed my phone from my nightstand to use the flashlight, went back to her room, and walked to the window. I raised the frame. The wooden catch gave easy, the way it always had on that window since I was a boy. I pushed the frame up, the window opened, and the cold night air came in all at once. That wood's cold, damp earth smell with pine underneath. I turned on the phone flashlight and pointed it outside. The outer sill had mud on it. Not a smear, not rain splash. Real mud, dark, in 2 parallel, uneven marks running from the right side of the sill to almost the center. The sill was about 8 inches deep and the marks covered maybe 6 of them. I stood there staring at it for a stretch of time I couldn't tell you. Then I pointed the flashlight down at the screen. The screen was torn. The tear ran from the bottom right corner, the one that was already a little loose, to almost the middle of the panel. It wasn't an inside-out tear, the kind that happens when someone pushes by accident. The edges were bent inward. The mesh was folded inward toward the room, like something had reached in from outside and pulled. I stood there with the phone in my hand and the cold hitting my face and chest, and what I felt wasn't exactly fear. It was that strange feeling of looking at something that doesn't fit, like when you come home and you know someone touched something, but you can't figure out what. The brain catches on before the logic does. Lily was watching me from the bed. I didn't turn to face her yet. I swept the flashlight across the outside. Tall grass, the strip of dirt between the house and the fence. The fence was there, the wire intact where I could see it. The trees beyond the fence were still. No wind at that moment, no leaf moving. I could hear my own feet on the wood floor, could hear Lily breathing behind me, and nothing else. No dog, no anything. I shut the window, fitted the catch back in place, looked at the torn screen from the inside and noticed the tear was about 16 inches long. That's not the kind of thing that happens from a branch. Not the kind of thing that happens from a deer poking around with its snout. I know how window screens give way. I've replaced enough of them in my life, it's part of the job sometimes. A customer will ask for it alongside an AC call. That screen had been pulled. I told Lily it must have been a curious animal, that it was gone now, that the window was closed and we were fine. She looked at me for a few seconds, then lay back down without arguing. Kids take what you say with a kind of trust that stings a little when you know you're only being partly honest. I grabbed the extra blanket folded at the foot of the bed, settled into the wooden chair in the corner of the room, and stayed there. Not because I was going to sleep, I knew I wasn't. I sat watching the closed window and the strip of darkness outside that the phone flashlight wasn't going to reach anyway. At some point, about 2 hours later, I went to check the back door a second time that night. It was locked. I looked through the kitchen window out at the porch and the grass beyond. Nothing I could see. The smell of damp wood was stronger by then. Or I was just paying more attention. I went back to the chair in Lily's room and stayed until the sun started to lighten the edges of the window. She slept the whole time. I didn't close my eyes once. The sun took its time getting there. First came that gray light the woods make before dawn. It's not light, it's just the dark getting less dark. I stayed in the chair watching that shift for maybe 40 minutes, neck stiff and knees aching from the cold, turning over the kinds of things you turn over when you're too tired to distract yourself. I was 140 miles from my apartment. That might not sound like much when you say it out loud, but at 5 in the morning, in a house with no immediate neighbors with a 6-year-old sleeping 2 feet away from me, 140 miles is a distance you feel in your body. Back at the apartment, I had the neighbors in 4B who fought every Thursday. I had the lit-up hallway, I had the intercom, I had the street with traffic. I had the feeling that the world kept going on the other side of the door, running, inhabited. Here there were the woods. There was the silence that came back after every small sound. There was me, and there was Lily. It's different when you're alone. When you're alone and you feel afraid, you negotiate with that fear one way or another. You go check, you decide it's nothing, or you decide it's something and you act. The fear is yours and you do whatever you want with it. But when there's a child, the fear changes shape. It stops being about you and becomes about her. And then it gets a lot bigger and a lot harder to negotiate with. I sat watching Lily sleep and tried to be rational. It could be nothing. That was the most likely option. I knew that. Old screen, loose in one corner, giving way under the weight of a small animal on the sill. A raccoon, maybe, which are strong for their size and will pry open anything that isn't properly fastened. Muddy paws. An accidental tear. Lily hearing the sound of her own stuffy nose and building a big dog out of it. Because kids do that? It's what they do. I used to do it myself when I was little. Could be nothing. It was probably nothing. But I was in an isolated house, in the middle of a county I didn't know well. And the screen had been torn from the outside in. It could be a person. That thought had been sitting at the back of my head since the middle of the night, and I hadn't let myself look straight at it until now. A person. Someone who knew the house had been sitting empty for months, who knew Earl had died, who had been using the property during that time, to stash something, to shelter, whatever, and had shown up tonight and found lights on and a truck in the yard. A person who had come up to the window to see what was going on inside. A person with bad intentions or with no clear intention at all, which is sometimes worse. I didn't have a weapon. Earl had kept a hunting shotgun in his bedroom closet, but I hadn't checked if it was still there. And even if it was, I had no shells. And even if I had shells, the last time I'd fired a gun was at a rented shooting range with a college buddy about 12 years ago. Could be a wild animal. Not a raccoon. Something bigger. A stray dog maybe. Lost or abandoned. The kind that turns aggressive when it's hungry. Wild boar, which sometimes come closer to inhabited areas than people expect. A bear, which they do have in North Georgia, though I'd never seen one. The mud on the sill showed marks from something that had braced its weight there, and the sill sat about 30 inches off the ground, consistent with a large animal on its hind legs, or a person lying flat and leaning in, or something I couldn't fit into any category yet, because I didn't have enough information, and my exhausted mind was filling the gap with shapes that didn't quite make sense. What I knew for certain was this. Something or someone had come up to the window of the room where my daughter was sleeping, had gotten close enough to leave mud on the sill and tear the screen. And I had sat in a chair for the rest of the night instead of doing something concrete, because I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to wake Lily. When the sun actually came up, I got to my feet slowly so I wouldn't make noise, grabbed my jacket from the hook in the hallway, and pulled on my sneakers without socks because my socks were in the bag in the other room, and went out the back door. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and pine resin. I went straight to the east side of the house where Lily's room was. The marks were there. On the ground below the window, the mud was churned up over an area maybe 3 feet across. It wasn't a clear footprint. It was more like a zone of pressure, where something had stood still or moved in a tight circle. In the middle of that zone were 2 deeper marks, close together, irregular in shape, wide. I crouched down and held my open hand next to them to compare. Bigger than my hand. Considerably bigger, not raccoon tracks. I followed the side of the house toward the back fence. The tall grass was flattened in an uneven line that came from the direction of the fence and led up to the window. I followed that line in reverse, toward the fence, and saw that one post was slightly tilted. Not knocked over, but with its base loosened, like something heavy had passed close to it without caring what was in the way. I stood there with my feet wet from the dew and my toes numb inside my sockless sneakers, looking at the line of pines beyond the fence. The birds that normally fill those trees in the early morning, and Earl always complained about them, said they made too much noise, weren't making any noise. I only noticed that in that moment, only when the silence got too heavy to ignore. No chirping, no rustling wings. The trees were still and quiet as if they were empty. I went back inside. I called Tommy before making coffee, but the call dropped twice before it could connect. I sent a text after that, but the signal was down to 1 bar and I didn't know if it had gone through. Tommy was supposed to have come on this trip. That was the original plan. The 2 of us together to clean out Earl's house, and Lily would have come along because it was my weekend. But Tommy had backed out Thursday night with some excuse about overtime that I hadn't pushed back on because Tommy always had an excuse. I made coffee on the stove because Earl's electric coffee maker had stopped working at some point over the past few months. I kept the flame low and stood looking through the kitchen window at the front yard, at the truck, at the gravel road far out. When Lily woke up and came into the kitchen with her hair smashed flat and the turtle book under her arm, she looked at me and asked if I had slept. I said yes. She nodded like she didn't believe me, picked up the glass of juice I'd set out for her, and didn't say another word about the night. Didn't ask about the big dog. She just stood there drinking her juice with both hands on the glass, looking out the window, the same way I'd been standing there looking at the line of empty pines 10 minutes before. It wasn't the look of a kid staring at nothing. It was the look of someone waiting to see something move. Ruth Maynard lived about half a mile down the road, in a yellow house with a covered porch full of fern pots she probably hadn't watered since fall. I knew who she was because Earl mentioned her name with the frequency people mention longtime neighbors. Not every day, but whenever the context allowed. Ruth Maynard says it's going to rain this week. Ruth Maynard saw a deer in the orchard. Ruth Maynard brought over an apple pie. She had been friends with my grandmother before my grandmother died, and after that she'd stayed friends with Earl in the practical way people do, showing up when it was needed, disappearing when it wasn't. I knew her by sight and by name. I'd never had a real conversation with her. I left Lily with the charged tablet and instructions not to open the door for anyone, which was a strange thing to say on a property with no immediate neighbors, but I said it anyway. She was too focused on a building game to question it. I went out the front door and walked down the gravel road because the truck had an issue I hadn't properly looked into yet. When I'd started it the morning before, it had made a dry knock I didn't like, and I'd rather not risk it. The air was warmer than it had been in the last few hours. It smelled of dry earth and that woody undertone of forest that starts releasing moisture once the sun hits it. I could hear my footsteps on the gravel and not much else. No cars went by. Ruth answered the door before I knocked, which made me think she'd seen me coming up the road. She was smaller than I remembered. White hair pulled back, blue and white checkered apron, rubber-soled slippers. 70 years old if that, but with the manner of an older person who has already decided they're done pretending to an energy they don't have. She looked up at me, not because I was particularly tall, but because she was standing one step below the threshold, and said my name. Not as a question. She said, "Mason." I told her that was me, asked if I could come in for a second. She stood still for a moment before opening the door wider. The house smelled like old coffee and a lavender sachet probably tucked away in some drawer. There was a TV on low in the corner of the room. News channel. A reporter standing in the rain in some city I didn't recognize. She turned it off without comment and pointed me to the chair near the window. She stayed standing near the kitchen counter on the other side of the room, arms crossed. She didn't offer me coffee. I told her I was at Earl's house to start sorting things out. Said I'd spent the night there with my daughter. Said something had come up to her bedroom window in the middle of the night, and that I'd found marks on the sill and on the ground. Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked which window. I told her it was the east window, the one that faced the woods. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're confirming something they already knew but wanted to verify. That small movement bothered me more than anything she could have said. I asked if she'd seen anything on the property over the past few months. Animal, person, whatever. She said she hadn't seen anything concrete. Concrete was a strange word choice. I asked what she meant by that. Ruth uncrossed her arms, picked up a dish towel that was folded on the counter, and held it in her hands without doing anything with it. She said that Earl, in the last 2 months before he died, had called her a few times, in the middle of the night, which wasn't like him. Earl was the type who went to bed at 9 and was up at 5. He had no nighttime habits. She said that on the calls he didn't talk much. The first time he said he'd heard something moving around the yard. The second time he said the dogs from the neighbor at the end of the road, about 2 miles up, had been barking for 2 hours and then stopped all at once. On the third call he didn't say anything specific. He just stayed on the line for a few minutes and then hung up. I asked when the third call had been. She said it was about 10 days before he died. I went quiet. The turned-off TV had left a silence that wasn't heavy. It was just old house silence, with the refrigerator humming in the background. But I became aware of it all of a sudden. I asked if she had told anyone about this. Family, his doctor, whoever had handled things after Earl passed. She said no. She said Earl was 79 years old, had a bad heart, and had lived alone on a property in the middle of the woods for 30 years. She said that when a man like that calls in the middle of the night talking about sounds in the yard, people assume one thing, and that thing isn't necessarily the wrong one. I understood what she was saying, that people had assumed it was the beginning of the end, his mind going, the isolation getting to him, the fears of an old man living alone. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe Earl had been afraid and hadn't known quite of what, and maybe the fears of old men are made of shadows and wind sounds and nothing more. But Ruth had said nothing concrete, and she wasn't looking at me with the expression of someone dismissing a possibility. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who had chosen not to look any deeper. I asked her directly, "Do you think there's something out in those woods?" She folded the dish towel carefully, set it back on the counter, and said that North Georgia has a lot of things in the woods that people from the city aren't used to accounting for. She said it without any inflection, the way someone comments on the weather. Then she looked at me and said I should get my daughter out of there before dark. She didn't say why, didn't add anything. I sat in the chair for a few seconds, not knowing what to do with that. Then I stood up, thanked her, and headed for the door. She didn't walk me out. When I was at the threshold, she said my name once and I turned around. She asked if the east window was locked. I said the wooden catch fitted in place, but there was no key. She nodded again with that same motion of someone confirming what they'd already suspected. She didn't say anything else. I left. The gravel under my feet on the way back sounded different than on the way there. Louder, or I was paying more attention. I watched the tree line on the left side of the road the whole way, not sure exactly what I was looking for, and reached Earl's house with the same strange feeling of having gone out looking for one answer and come back with 3 questions in its place. Lily was where I'd left her, tablet in her lap, feet tucked underneath her on the couch, completely somewhere else. I went to Earl's room and opened the closet. The shotgun wasn't there. I had gone to Blue Ridge to work. That part I almost forgot to mention because it seems beside the point next to everything that happened after. But it's relevant to understanding the state I was in that afternoon. The original idea was simple. Spend the weekend, start clearing out Earl's house, separate what to donate, what to throw away, what to take. There were boxes in the truck bed. There were black garbage bags folded inside one of the boxes. I'd made a list on my phone with the rooms in order of priority. Kitchen first, then his bedroom, then the garage. I hadn't opened a single box, hadn't filled a single bag, hadn't touched anything of Earl's besides the broken coffee maker and the closet where the shotgun wasn't anymore. I stood in the middle of his room for a few minutes after checking the closet, looking at his things the way he'd left them. The bed made with the green blanket he'd always used. The analog alarm clock on the nightstand stopped at 4:17, battery dead. The framed photo of my grandmother that had been in the same spot since I was a child, next to the alarm clock, tilted slightly to the right. I couldn't bring myself to straighten it. It wasn't exactly grief. It was more that feeling of being in a space that still holds the shape of someone. The volumes, the habits, the organizational logic of an entire life, and knowing you're going to have to take it apart with your own hands. I didn't want to do that. I had agreed to do it because there was no one else, but I didn't want to. And now there was something else I didn't want to think about. Ruth Maynard had told me to leave before dark. It was 2 in the afternoon. I went to the living room window and looked at the sky outside, calculating daylight. In March, in North Georgia, the sun goes down around 6:30. I had maybe 4.5 hours. The truck had a problem. I had avoided checking it properly because part of me didn't want to confirm what that dry knock the morning before had suggested. But now I went out to the yard, popped the hood, and stood looking at the engine like I was going to understand more than I did, which wasn't little. I've worked with mechanical systems my whole life, but combustion engines aren't my specialty. What I found was the alternator belt with a crack down the middle that hadn't been there when I'd left Elijah. That's not the kind of thing that happens overnight on a truck that's been sitting still. It happens with use, with wear. But the truck had been sitting still. I crouched down and looked under the chassis. Nothing there. I stood back up and rested my hands on the open hood in the cold afternoon sun, thinking. With that belt, I could start the engine. I could get out on the road. But without the alternator charging, the battery would last maybe 30-40 minutes before it died. And I had no way of knowing where on the road it would choose to die. Could be out on the pavement of 515, could be on the half-mile of gravel before that. At night, on a road with no shoulder, with Lily in the front seat. I closed the hood. I picked up my phone to call Deb. 1 bar. The call didn't connect. I tried Tommy again, same thing. I sent texts to both of them saying where I was and that I had a problem with the truck, but the messages sat with the undelivered symbol. That little clock that keeps spinning. The signal on this property had never been good. I remembered Earl complaining about it, but I hadn't thought of it as a problem until now. I went to check the back fence. The post I'd noticed leaning that morning was leaning more now, or I was looking at it differently. The base had come out of its original hole and shifted about 6 inches to the side. The wire around it was stretched at the wrong angle, not broken but giving way. The gap between that post and the next one was wider than it should be, maybe 20 inches of slack in the wire, enough for something not too large to squeeze through crouching, or for something large to push through with enough force not to care what the wire does. I walked the entire length of fence I could see, about 260 feet. In 3 spots the wire was bent, folded toward the inside of the property. Not torn, not cut. Folded, like something had gone over or under it with weight and in a hurry. I went back inside without making noise because Lily was asleep on the living room couch with the tablet still open in her lap. I didn't want to wake her. I went to the kitchen and leaned back against the counter with my arms crossed, staring at nothing, and tried to think clearly. I hadn't done a single thing I'd come to do. Hadn't touched a box, hadn't emptied a drawer, hadn't started the basic inventory that justified the trip, and at that moment I wasn't sure any of it mattered anymore. Earl's house, Earl's things, the responsibility of being the only available Pruitt, all of it had gotten small over the past 12 hours. It had shrunk down to background noise. The background now was the bent fence and the cracked alternator belt, and the unlocked window and Ruth Maynard looking at me with the expression of someone who had chosen not to look any deeper. Had it been worth the risk? I couldn't answer that. I knew I had come because someone had to, and that I had brought Lily because it was my weekend, and because she'd asked, and because I had thought it would be good for her to see the place where her great-grandfather had lived. That decision, at that point in the afternoon, sat on me like something physical, like a real weight placed in the chest. She was asleep on the couch, 6 years old, with her hair fanned out on the cushion and a dry line of drool at the corner of her mouth and the tablet showing the home screen because it had locked itself. She had no idea, and I needed it to stay that way. I went to the back door, checked the lock, went to the kitchen window, checked the latch, went down the hall, checked the bathroom window. Too small for anything large to get through, but I checked it anyway. Went to Lily's room and stood looking at the torn screen with the afternoon light coming through it. I needed to fix that. Needed something to seal the gap, even if just temporary. I went out to Earl's garage and went through the shelves. There was a roll of wide silver adhesive tape, the duct tape kind. I took it. I cut strips and covered the tear from the inside, folding the bent mesh back into place before pressing the tape down. It wasn't a solution. It was just the idea of a solution. The feeling of having done something concrete on a day when I hadn't done anything that counted. The sky started going orange at 5:40. I went to wake Lily. Lily didn't want dinner. It wasn't a tantrum. She sat at the table looking at her plate of mac and cheese with that closed stomach expression kids get when something is wrong, but they don't have a name for it. I didn't push her. I ate mine without any appetite either, standing by the stove, keeping an eye on the kitchen window that was already black with night outside. I tried my phone 3 more times after dinner. Nothing. One bar that came and went without being good for anything. I thought about walking to Ruth Maynard's house, but it was almost 8 at night, and I wasn't going to leave Lily alone, not even for half a mile. I thought about taking her with me, but Ruth had told me to leave before dark, and dark had come and gone hours ago. I did what I could, locked everything that had a lock, pushed the coffee table against the back door, which was the weakest of the 3 entry points. Thin wood, old hinges, the kind of door that marks a boundary and not much else. I took the heaviest wooden chair from the living room and wedged it under the front door handle, the way I'd seen done in a movie once, and never thought I'd actually do in real life. Closed every window that could close properly. I took Lily to the bedroom and we both lay down in Grandpa Earl's bed because her room had the window with the screen, and I wanted to stay away from that window. The mattress smelled like that old talcum powder he used. Lily lay quiet beside me for about 10 minutes and then fell into a real sleep. Her hand curled in a fist against her chin. I stared at the ceiling. I don't know what time it was when the sound started. My phone had no signal, but it still showed the time. It was 11:42 when I checked. The sound wasn't sudden. It came like this. First nothing, then the feeling of nothing. That silence that isn't neutral, it's compressed, as if the normal sounds of the night had been deliberately removed. Then a low sound I located at first as coming from the direction of the garage. A scraping, rhythmic, slow, like heavy wood being dragged across concrete. I sat up in bed slowly. The sound stopped. I stayed still for maybe 2 minutes. Lily didn't wake. The sound didn't come back. I was about to decide it was the wind moving something in the garage. Earl had a lot of things stacked in that garage, when it came from somewhere else. From the side of the house, the east side. It wasn't the same sound, it was breathing. I hear that word back now, 8 months later, and I know it sounds simple. Breathing. Every living thing breathes. It isn't frightening by nature. But what came through the side of the house that night was breathing with volume and with weight, the kind of sound you associate with something large, large lungs, a large chest cavity expanding and contracting at a pace that wasn't hurried. It was slow, almost patient, and it was moving. That was the detail that locked me in place. The sound had direction, had progression. It started further toward the garage, shifted along the side wall and kept coming toward the side of the house where I was. It didn't run, didn't advance all at once. It came the way a clock hand comes. You can't see it moving, but when you look again, it's somewhere else. I got out of bed without making a sound, left Lily sleeping, went to Earl's bedroom window. This one faced the front of the property, not the east side, and looked outside without turning on anything. The moon was coming out from behind a cloud and throwing a thin gray light over the yard, the truck, the gravel road. The breathing continued outside. Closer now. I went to the hallway, stopped, went to the front door. The chair was still wedged under the handle. I looked through the peephole. Empty yard, moonlight, nothing moving. The breathing was on the back porch. I didn't decide to go. I didn't make a conscious decision of the I'm going to look kind. What happened was that I found myself with my hand on the coffee table I had pushed against the back door, moving it to the side slowly, silently, 1 inch at a time. Then my hand on the door handle. Then the door opened 2 inches and the cold night air hitting my face. I looked through the gap. The back porch was about 10 feet deep with a low wood ceiling. The moon didn't hit it directly, it sat in shadow. But the shadow wasn't uniform. In the right corner of the porch there was a shape that shouldn't have been there. Not a complete form. It was a section of something. What I could see was the lower part, from about windowsill height down. 2 limbs, too long. The joints at the wrong angle to be human, an angle that bent slightly outward before bending down, as if the knee worked differently. The foot, if it was a foot, was flat on the wood floor of the porch, wide, with what weren't exactly toes but arranged themselves like toes, dark, ending in points I didn't want to look at more closely. The breathing was coming from there, deep, slow. The torso, what I read as a torso, the volume above the limbs, expanded and contracted in the dark. I could see that movement, rhythmic, heavy. It didn't see me, or it didn't react to me. It stayed still, breathing as if it were waiting for something or simply was there. I closed the door. As slowly as I had opened it, I pressed my back against the hallway wall and stood there, my heart making a sound that I thought for a second was going to be heard from outside. Something was on Earl's porch, and between it and my 6-year-old daughter was a thin wooden door, old hinges, and a coffee table I had pushed aside to take a look. I stayed pressed against the wall for I don't know how long. The kind of terror that locks your body isn't like it is in the movies, where the person goes rigid with their eyes wide open. It's more ordinary than that. It's the brain processing too much information at the same time, and simply stopping all instruction. I was flat against the hallway wall with my hands open on the wood behind me, and my thoughts spinning in circles that went nowhere. The breathing outside continued for a while longer. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, emptier, more final. I went to Earl's room in the dark, without turning on anything. Lily was sleeping exactly the way I'd left her, fist curled against her chin. I stood in the doorway looking at her for a moment and felt something I can't quite name. It wasn't relief that she was sleeping, because her sleeping didn't solve anything. It was more that mix of love and responsibility that hurts when you feel both at the same time, and know that one demands too much from the other. I went to the bedroom window and looked out at the front yard. The thing was there, not on the porch anymore. It was in the yard, between the house and the truck facing the window where I was standing. This time I had enough moonlight and enough distance to see more. Not everything. Never everything, because of the shadow and because my head wouldn't let my eyes stay fixed on one point for too long. But I saw enough. Tall. Too tall. Its head rose above the roofline of the truck, and the truck stands close to 6.5 feet. It was standing, but the way it stood was different. Tilted slightly forward, weight to the front, long arms hanging down to nearly knee height. The fur was uneven, in dark tufts that left strips of visible skin between them, and in the moonlight that skin looked grayish, stretched, like wet leather drying out. The snout was long and the jaw appeared crooked in a way I can't stop seeing. Its eyes caught the light the way human eyes don't. They didn't shine like headlights. It was different. It was like when you see a cat in the dark, and the retina throws the light back at a strange angle. It was looking at the window. I stepped back 1 step, then 2, kept looking. It didn't move. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me in the dark of the room, it in the yard, both of us still. Then it turned, slowly, without any hurry, like something getting its bearings. It walked toward the side of the house in the direction of the garage and moved out of my line of sight. I went to wake Lily. I put my hand on her shoulder carefully and pressed once. She opened her eyes without startling, which is something kids do sometimes that seems impossible. I spoke low, close to her ear, that we needed to go right now, that she needed to be quiet, that she was going to hold my hand and not let go for anything. She looked at me for a second with her eyes still heavy, and then sat up, picked up the turtle book that was in the bed with her, and stood. I wished she had left the book. I didn't say anything. The question was the exit. The front door opened to the yard where the thing had been. The back door opened to the porch where it had been before that. Windows, most too small, and opening a window makes noise. The bathroom window was small, but Lily could fit through it. I couldn't. I could send Lily through the bathroom window. That thought came and I refused it before I'd finished forming it. I was not sending my 6-year-old daughter out alone into the dark while that thing moved around the yard. That was not a possibility. The front door was the only option big enough for both of us, and the yard was between us and the road. If I could get to the truck, the belt was worn, but the engine would start, and 30 minutes of battery was enough to reach the pavement. Maybe enough to get to Ruth's house, maybe enough to get further. The thing had gone toward the garage side. The garage was on the right, the truck was on the left. If it was in the garage, there were maybe 15 yards of open yard between the front door and the truck door. 15 yards. At 6 years old, Lily runs what? Maybe 6 feet a second, 10 on a good day? I could carry her, but carrying her made me slower, taller, more visible. Her running beside me made her faster but more exposed if I stumbled. I was calculating escape speeds with my 6-year-old in a dirt yard in North Georgia at 11 at night, with something large moving around outside. I grabbed the truck key from the hook near the front door, grabbed Lily's jacket from the chair in the living room, crouched in front of her and put the jacket on her without turning on any lights, working by touch and memory. She let me, quiet. Then she leaned in and spoke into my ear, so low I almost didn't catch it. She said, "The big dog is close." It wasn't a question. I told her I knew. I told her we were going to run out together, that she was going to hold my hand, that she wasn't going to look to either side, only straight ahead, that when I said go, she was going to run as hard as she could. She nodded. I went to the living room window and looked out at the yard. Empty. Looked toward the garage side. Dark. No visible movement. I pulled the chair away from the front door handle, unlocked it, opened it a crack and the cold air came in. I looked. Nothing in the immediate field of view. The truck was about 12 steps away. I took Lily's hand. I counted 3 in my head and opened the door. We ran. The gravel in the yard was loud under my feet, too loud, and I could hear Lily breathing beside me, fast and focused, no crying, no screaming. She was actually running, small feet pumping the ground hard. I kept my eyes forward, on the truck door, on the handle, on the key in my hand. That's when I heard the sound coming from the direction of the garage. It wasn't breathing, it was impact. Heavy weight moving fast, the sound of something large that had stopped being patient. I didn't look. I pulled the truck door open, threw Lily in, climbed in behind her, pulled it shut. Key in the ignition. The engine made the dry knock I knew and turned over. The rearview mirror, the shape came out of the shadow of the garage. I threw it in reverse. I backed out of the yard without looking in the mirror again. Once was enough. That shape coming out of the shadow of the garage. The size of it, the way it moved. Too fast for something that large. Was enough information to last the rest of my life. I didn't need more. Lily was in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up to her chest, and the turtle book held in both arms. She wasn't crying. She was staring through the windshield with a focus that reminded me, in a way that was completely out of place at that moment, of the look she got when she was working on a hard puzzle. Concentrated, like she was solving a problem. I hit the gear into drive before I'd finished reversing and the truck lurched forward. The headlights opened up the gravel road ahead, narrow, with woods closing in on both sides, low branches I normally eased around slowly. I didn't ease around anything. I pushed the truck as hard as it would go on that gravel. And the gravel was uneven, and the suspension was old, and we both hit our heads on the roof once each over a hole I didn't see. Lily didn't say a word, kept holding the book. The dashboard was lit up normal, speedometer climbing, engine temp normal, fuel at half. The only gauge I was watching was the battery. Without the alternator working right, The needle was going to start dropping at some point, and once it dropped, it wouldn't take long. I'd told myself 30-40 minutes earlier. Now, pushing it with the headlights on full, that time was shrinking. It was roughly 2.5 miles to the pavement of 5:15. On gravel, in the dark, in that state. I'd cover that in maybe 8 minutes if nothing broke along the way. After the pavement, Blue Ridge was about 7 miles out. With battery, no problem. Without battery, it was a truck on the shoulder of a state highway in the middle of the night, with spotty cell signal. I ran the calculations while I drove because calculating gave my brain something to do besides replay what I'd seen in the mirror. Ruth Maynard's house came up in the headlights sooner than I expected. I'd forgotten it was before the pavement, not after. Her porch light was on, that yellow old bulb light that stays on all night. I drove past. About 200 yards later, I stopped. I sat there with the engine running and the headlights on the road ahead and my hands on the wheel, and I couldn't keep going. Ruth Maynard was 70 years old, lived alone. She had told me to leave before dark, and I hadn't left, and the creature had been moving through Earl's property for hours, and Ruth's house was half a mile down the road. Half a mile I had just covered in under 2 minutes, which meant that thing, if it wanted to, could cover that distance in a time I didn't want to calculate. Lily looked at me. I said her name, told her I needed to make a quick stop at the neighbor's house to warn her. Said it would be fast. She said, "I know." I drove back slowly to the yellow house, pulled into the yard, left the engine running, left the headlights on, left Lily in the seat with instructions to lock the door the second I got out and only open it when I knocked 3 times. She locked it before I finished the sentence. I ran to the porch and knocked on the door. Hard, fast, the kind of knock that doesn't leave any doubt. Ruth opened it sooner than I expected. She was dressed, which surprised me. Not in bed, not in a robe. Pants, a wool sweater, the same rubber slippers, like she hadn't slept. I told her she needed to come with me right now. Told her I had the truck, there was room. We could go to Blue Ridge together and she could call whoever she wanted from there. I talked fast and without stopping because I didn't have time to build an argument. She looked at me for a moment, then looked at the truck with its headlights on in her yard, then looked at the woods to the right of the property, which started past an old wood fence about 60 feet from the house. She said she needed to get something inside. I told her there was no time to get anything. She said, "1 minute, Mason." She went in. I stood at the threshold, 30 seconds, 40. I looked at the woods, looked at the truck where Lily was, looked at my phone clock, 12:18. Ruth came back with a coat and a small leather bag that looked about 50 years old. She walked past me without a word and headed toward the truck. I pulled her front door shut. I don't know why I closed it. She was leaving, not coming back. But I closed it. The 3 miles to the pavement felt longer than the 4 I'd covered running. I drove slower now, with Ruth in the middle of the bench and Lily pressed against the passenger door. The silence between the 3 of us was the kind that doesn't ask for conversation. Ruth held the leather bag in her lap and kept her eyes on the road the whole time. When the tires hit the pavement of 5:15, I let out a breath. I turned right toward Blue Ridge and pushed it up to 55. The battery needle was sitting slightly below the middle, not critical, but falling. I checked it from the corner of my eye every 30 seconds. 10 minutes to the first lights of town. A gas station open, orange neon in the dark. I pulled into the lot, stopped, and sat with my hands on the wheel for a few seconds without being able to let go. Lily put her hand on my arm. She didn't say anything, just left it there. I picked up my phone. 4 bars. I called the Fannin County emergency line, which I didn't have memorized, but the phone found fast. Someone answered on 1 ring. I gave them Earl's property address, told them there was a threat, a large animal, aggressive, that I had gotten out with my daughter and an elderly woman. The dispatcher asked what kind of animal. I said I couldn't classify it. She asked if there were any injuries. I looked at Lily, looked at Ruth. I said no, that we'd gotten out in time. Ruth was looking out her window at the gas station lights outside. Her profile was still, the way a person looks when they're working through something internally and aren't going to share it. I was about to ask if she was okay. Before I opened my mouth, she said quietly without turning, "I should have left sooner." She wasn't talking to me. She wasn't talking to Lily. She was talking to the glass, to her own reflection in the glass, to something whose size only she knew. I didn't answer. The gas station's neon hummed faintly in the silence of the car. Lily still had her hand on my arm. The truck engine idled, and I thought I should turn it off to save the battery, but I couldn't turn it off. I needed that sound. The three of us stayed like that until the patrol car appeared on the shoulder of 515, with its light going, 40 minutes later. Deputy Cal Hester was a large man, around 45, with shoulders that filled out his vest in a way that looked uncomfortable. He arrived in a patrol car with another vehicle behind it. A younger officer, whose name I didn't catch, who stayed in the gas station lot with Lily while Hester talked to me outside. The conversation was strange from the start. Not because he was unfriendly. Hester was the calm professional type who lets you talk without interrupting and writes in his notepad in small print without showing any reaction. The problem was that as I talked, the torn screen, the marks on the ground, the fence, what I had seen on the porch, what I had seen in the yard, I could hear the words coming out of my mouth, and they sounded in a way I hadn't anticipated. They sounded like the account of a person who hadn't slept, who had been alone in a dark place, who had gotten scared of something and built the rest out of it. Hester kept writing. When I finished, he closed the notepad and said he'd send a team out to the property to check. He said it with the same tone someone uses to say they're going to check a gas leak. Procedure, protocol. No visible urgency, but no dismissiveness either. He asked if I needed medical attention. I said no. He asked about Ruth. Ruth was still in the truck, leather bag in her lap. Hester walked over to her and tapped lightly on the window. She rolled it down. I didn't hear what they said. I stood outside watching through the rear window of the truck. I could see Hester in profile, Ruth facing forward, her expression the same as when she had looked at the woods before getting into the truck with me. That expression that isn't exactly fear, it's recognition. The conversation was short. Hester came back to where I was standing, wrote one more thing in the notepad, and said he would personally go out to the property that night. He said Ruth could stay at the gas station if she wanted, that the younger officer would stay with her. He asked if I wanted to go with the team. I looked at the truck, at Lily in the passenger seat with the young officer standing outside talking to her through the open window about something I couldn't hear, and she was answering with hand gestures, which meant she was probably talking about sea turtles. I told Hester no. He nodded, no judgment. Said he'd call me when he had any information. He took my number, went to the patrol car, said something on the radio, and drove out of the lot back onto 515 heading north. I went inside the station, bought 3 coffees. None of the 3 of us ended up drinking, and a small bottle of water for Lily that she drank halfway and left in the cup holder. I sat on a plastic bench near the window with the foam cup in my hands and my phone on my thigh, waiting. Ruth stayed in the truck. At 2:40 in the morning, Hester called. He said the team had reached the property and done a full check. Said they found the marks I had described. On the sill, on the ground, along the fence. Said the screen was torn the way I had reported. Said there were tracks in the yard, pressure marks in the mud that they had photographed. He said all of this in the voice of someone reading from a report, sequential, no inflection. Then there was a pause that lasted too long to be a normal pause. He said they had found the garage door forced from the inside, that the inside of the garage had been torn apart, that there was a chest freezer at the back of the garage, the large lid-top kind that farmers use to store meat, and that the freezer was open and empty, the lid's hinges bent outward. Earl had kept that freezer for years. I remembered it vaguely, big and white, sitting at the back of the garage beside the tool shelves. I hadn't paid any attention to it during the weekend. Hester asked if I knew what Earl kept in the freezer. I said I didn't. He said they would need to do a more detailed analysis of the site in daylight. Said I shouldn't go back to the property without notifying them first. Said he'd keep me informed. I hung up. I sat looking at the cold coffee cup in my hand. The station's neon kept humming. Lily had fallen asleep in the truck with her head tilted to one side, the turtle book fallen in her lap. I walked to the truck and tapped lightly on Ruth's window. She opened the door. I asked if she knew what Earl kept in the garage freezer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Earl had a habit of storing game meat. He still hunted, up until about 2 years before he died, when his knee wouldn't let him anymore. Deer mostly. Wild boar sometimes. I asked if that was what was in the freezer when he died. She said she didn't know, that she hadn't been inside the garage. We sat in silence. The young officer had gone back to the patrol car and was visible through the windshield, doing something with his dashboard. A truck went by on 515, the only vehicle that had passed since we'd arrived. Ruth said, without me having asked anything, Earl mentioned once, about 3 months before he died, that he had found marks on the back fence. Said something was crossing through the property at night, that he had started leaving meat outside the garage. I stopped. I asked why he would do that. She stared forward for a few seconds, then said Earl had spent his entire life on that land, that he knew every animal that moved through there, that when he didn't recognize something, he stayed quiet and watched before acting. That was his way. I asked if she thought he had tried to negotiate. She didn't answer right away. When she did, it was low, almost to herself. She said, I think he was trying to buy time. The coffee in the foam cup was completely cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. I threw it in the trash can outside the station, got back in the truck, started the engine for the heat, and sat watching Lily sleep. Earl had died in February, alone, from causes the doctor had documented as heart failure, which was true. His heart had genuinely stopped. But now I kept thinking about what had come before that. The calls to Ruth, the freezer full of meat, the nights he had spent in that house knowing something was moving around outside, and the fact that he hadn't talked to anyone but Ruth, hadn't asked to leave, hadn't asked for help. He had just stayed inside, alone, buying time. There's a point where you stop checking the window every time you turn on the bedroom light. Not that I've stopped completely, but now it's automatic in a different way. It's the kind of habit you no longer notice, like checking the stove or hitting the lock button on your car twice even though you know it already locked. It's part of the routine now. It moved in without asking and stayed. I still live in the same apartment in LJ. 3rd floor, 2 bedrooms, living room window that faces a covered parking lot. The neighbor in 4B still fights every Thursday with someone I've never seen. The hallway is still lit. The city still makes that background noise you only notice when it's gone. Lily lives with Deb during the week and comes to me on alternating weekends. She doesn't talk about what happened in Blue Ridge. Not that I know of. Deb told me she mentioned it once sometime later, that she had seen a big dog at Grandpa Earl's house, and that the dog had scared her dad, and that they had left in the car in the middle of the night. She said it the same way she'd describe an episode of a cartoon. Deb called me worried. We should set up an appointment with a therapist, so we did, and the therapist said Lily was fine, that children process things in ways adults don't recognize as processing, and that the fact that she had been able to narrate the event in a linear way without visible distress was a good sign. I pay my half of the therapist without complaining. Not because Deb asked me to, but because it seems like the least I can do. Deputy Hester called me a few times after that night. The first time, he said the team had done a full sweep of the property and the adjacent woods and hadn't found anything they could identify with certainty. There were tracks. There were the marks I had described. There was the forced open freezer, but no definitive conclusion about what had caused any of it. On a follow-up call, he said they had received other reports from residents in the area about large animals spotted or heard at night on different properties within a radius of about 10 miles. He didn't go into detail. The last time he called, he said my name, went quiet for a second, and asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. He said to reach out if I needed anything. We hung up. I didn't know how to read that last call, and I still don't. Earl's house is for sale. I hired a company out of Blue Ridge to do the clear-out. I paid for it, it wasn't cheap, but I didn't go back. I can't go back. Earl's things are in a storage unit I pay monthly and know I'll have to deal with someday, but that day hasn't come yet. The photo of my grandmother is in there, tilted slightly to the right the way he left it. I think about that sometimes. Ruth Maynard stayed in Blue Ridge. She has a niece in town who took her in after that night. We've texted twice. She's not a texter, but she replied. The second time she sent me a photo of a piece of embroidery she was working on, a fern in an oval frame, and I wrote back that it looked beautiful. That was it. We haven't talked about any of what happened. I don't know if we ever will. Tommy called me after a shortened, garbled version of the story appeared on a local news site out of Fannin County. He wanted to know everything. I told him enough and then said I had to get back to work. He still texts sometimes asking if there's any news. I tell him there isn't. What I know, the creature was real. It was physical. It left marks that were photographed and documented by a Fannin County officer who also couldn't classify what he had photographed. It wasn't a dream, wasn't a hallucination, wasn't an animal I know by name. It had been moving through Earl's property long enough for him to know about it before he died. Long enough for him to have developed some kind of quiet coexistence protocol that worked until it didn't anymore. What I don't know is bigger than what I know. I don't know what it was looking for in the freezer. I don't know if it was the meat Earl had stopped putting out after he died, or if it was something else. I don't know if it stayed on the property after we left or if it went somewhere. I don't know where. I don't know exactly what the other reports Hester mentioned described, and I didn't ask, because part of me didn't want to know if it was the same thing. That part won. There's one detail that has stayed with me in a way I can't quite explain. The morning after that night, while I was waiting for Hester to call, I realized that Lily's sea turtle book had been left behind at Earl's house. She had left it on the bed when I rushed in to wake her. I remembered it suddenly, there at the gas station in the middle of the night, and for about 5 minutes that was the only thought that filled everything. Not the creature, not the freezer, not what Hester was going to find. My daughter's school book, left behind on Grandpa Earl's bed. The clearing company found it and sent it along with a few other things I had left there. It arrived in a small box, wrapped in newspaper by some thoughtful employee. I opened the box in the building's parking garage and stood there looking at the book for a while before taking it upstairs. Lily saw it on the coffee table one weekend later. She picked it up, looked at the cover, and put it back without saying anything. Then she went to get juice from the refrigerator. I still don't understand what that thing was. I probably never will. But sometimes, when 4B stops fighting and the apartment goes truly quiet, I think about Earl, that 79-year-old man, bad heart, bad knee, alone in that house in North Georgia, and I wonder exactly what he heard on the nights before he fell asleep, and whether he slept at all.